Hey folks, and welcome back to the video lectures for Philosophy 120 Critical Thinking. So, today we are continuing our discussion of arguments, only this time we're going to get a bit more technical than we did last time. So previously, we've gone over the basics of the class, we've talked a little bit about arguments and why it's worth spending some time on them, and why for critical thinking it's something that we should care about, as well as a couple of signs for identifying and working with arguments when we try and see them out in the real world. Today, we're going to start looking at and building a toolkit for us to use to more deeply analyze and identify what's going on in different arguments. It's not enough to recognize that arguments exist or that they're out there. We also need to be able to talk about them with some degree of detail and rigor, and just basically give us a few more tools for working with these kinds of things as we continue trying to be better critical thinkers overall. So to that end, we're going to be looking at formatting arguments. We're going to look at sub-arguments and how structure and support some have different patterns throughout different arguments. We're going to look at some tips for locating conclusions and identifying claims in different arguments. We're also going to look briefly at the concepts of scope and commitment, and then look at a general approach that we can use for approaching arguments that don't always seem to have everything there. So, as I said, last time we focused a lot about the concept of arguments themselves, what they are and what they aren't. But if we're going to move forward, we do need a better understanding of the structure of these things. Critical thinking is about getting at the fundamental elements of a concept, about the fundamental parts of some idea or a problem or a situation, whatever it is that faces us, and seeing how those parts fit together. And that's a whole lot easier if you actually have a vocabulary and a set of ideas, a set of concepts that you can apply to recognize things. Take, for example, a simple psychological study that has been done a few different times on the differences between genders, for example. Men, if you're anything like the stereotypical Western American guy, you probably don't know what the word for that weird curtain thing that hangs on top of a window and between the two normal curtains. In fact, in a lot of cases, you probably don't even notice that it exists. Whereas, at least stereotypically and statistically, Western women are more likely to know that that thing's called a valence. And they're more likely to actually be aware of its existence. Even when they're looking right at it. Women, because they have a term for it, are more likely to notice things about it than men are. So, science has shown that having a word or a concept for something allows us to better identify and work with it than we would if we don't have a term or a concept to apply to it. Having a label gives us just another resource for analyzing things and allows us to do so with a lot more rigor and detail than we could before. So this lecture's goal is to help build up a toolkit, a set of concepts and definitions and vocab that we can use to help analyze how the different pieces of something, particularly arguments and ideas, fit together and relate to each other, so then we can start actually talking about those relations and evaluating them in future lectures and in future lessons. So, last time we were ending with the idea that a lot of arguments don't always come in easy to identify forms. So one tool that's really useful for us if we're going to move forward with evaluating and critiquing arguments and thinking deeply about them is the idea of standardizing an argument, of taking the loose, odd form that it might come in, shouted through a megaphone or presented over a political talk show, or simply given to you by your parents as they try and talk you into staying into school or whatever else. For the record, stay in school, don't do drugs. Okay? But, jokes and asides aside, standardizing an argument allows us to translate it from its loose, usually unstructured or unorganized form and into something that's a lot easier for us to work with. And this standardization is the kind of thing we already looked at a couple of examples of both in the textbook and in the last lecture. And if you've yet to take a look at Journal 1 yet, this is the kind of thing that Journal 1's asking you to translate an argument into. So when we talk about a standardized argument or a standard form argument, we're talking about uh, labeling and identifying the premises and the conclusions of an argument, of turning them into simple individual statements, and then organizing them like we have right here with numbered references. Often we put them on different lines, though that's less strictly necessary. But numbered and separated into distinct statements is definitely necessary. We try and remove some of the overly personal or irrelevant words like I believe that, or I enthusiastically believe X. A couple of those things just end up being there for flavor, whereas we're simply concerned with the material of an argument. So standardizing an argument takes out a little bit of the filler, the purely irrelevant things. When in doubt, leave it in. And puts it into this nice line by line organized format that allows us to easily refer to different parts of the argument quickly and easily without having to repeat ourselves the whole time. And we generally place the conclusion at the end of this sort of format after we've taken a look at the premises and the reasons for that conclusion. So here we have the general sort of form that we're talking about, where we have the different premises marked out and labeled. And here we have an example of it with an actual argument, that classic one that I said occurs in every philosophy class around the world. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Here, we've taken and distilled a general argument and labeled it nicely and neatly. Now I can start to say that claims 1 and 2, or premises 1 and 2, give a certain kind of support for premise or for claim 3, the conclusion. Excuse me. We also don't have any mystery about which one's the conclusion anymore. In fact, in some books and in some texts, they'll even label the premises as P1, P2, P3, and the conclusion as C1 or something like that, to make it even more abundantly clear which ones are the premises and which ones are the conclusions. Because in more complicated arguments, the ones we've looked at so far, or even the ones that our books handled so far, we can often get arguments within arguments. We can have sub-conclusions and other things that we'll talk about. So standardizing an argument makes it just a whole lot easier for us to work with this stuff. Now, that's probably a rather straightforward process for you. Their textbook has a few tips on standardizing these things. They're in chapter 2, and it gives you a few tips on what to look for this kind of stuff. But for the most part, this is a rather simple process. It's literally rewriting arguments. So let's start to get into some of the more technical vocabulary and the more technical tools that we can use to label and identify the different parts and pieces and structures present in arguments. The first of which will be what we refer to as a sub-argument. Now, a sub-argument is a statement that serves as a premise for one argument, but is a conclusion for another one. It's literally an argument within a larger argument that has its own conclusions and should be labeled as such. We can look at an example of this sort of thing down here at the bottom. Take this setup. I am a trained writer, therefore I know how to write a sentence. If I can write a sentence, then I can write words. Therefore, I can write words. Now, this tells us nothing new and interesting about the world. It's maybe a good argument in that it's reliable and it's got good reasons. It's definitely not an interesting argument. But it is interesting if we follow our indicator word strategy from last time to note that there are actually two different indicators for conclusions. So we might talk about claim 2 or line 2 being a sub-conclusion and line 4 being the main conclusion of the argument. There's a sub-argument moving from claims 1 to 2, and then again from 3 to 4, where we take the information that we've been given and we use that information to support some further claim. It's exactly like we would for the whole argument or the argument as a whole if we were looking at the big picture. So sub-arguments and sub-conclusions are things that we need to be aware of and that we ought to label when we find them. If we're standardizing an argument and we come across something that we think is a sub-conclusion, we should go out of our way to actually make sure that we mark that sort of thing, that we know how the different claims fit together, because that gives us some hint at the structure and the way that the different premises support each other. And this also starts to give us clues that we can later use when we're trying to evaluate arguments. And when we talk about the structure of an argument or how the different premises fit together, there's a couple of different ways that we can work with this. And there's a couple of different ways we can use this notion of a sub-argument as well as premises and conclusions and so on to talk about these things. So two very common sorts of structures, different ways that an argument might be laid out, are what we call divergent structures and linear structures. Both of these are rather well illustrated by diagrams here and in the textbook, with lots more examples if you want to go back to it. But in short, a divergent structure is one in which one premise actually supports multiple distinct conclusions. This will sometimes be written as entirely separate arguments, but with the same initial claim or the same premise included in both, and showing that this one idea has two different sets of implications to it. Linear structures, by contrast, instead link the different premises together much more tightly and in a single chain, literally like a chain, in which each claim is a sub-argument for the next claim. Each premise supports the one that comes after it. If it helps, here's a couple of examples of these. Arguments that have a divergent structure would be ones like these here on the left. Studying leads to good grades, therefore you should study if you want good grades. And then entirely separately, studying leads to good grades, therefore if you do not study, you will not get good grades. Just like the diagram here, where we have one premise supporting and flowing to two separate conclusions, here we have in lines 1, in both places, a same singular idea, but it's supporting two different conclusions. Now, they more or less tell you the same thing because I could not think of a better example at the time. I initially wrote some of this when it was late and I was rather tired. But despite being a boring example, it still illustrates that structure rather well. In the same way, we again have the same sort of thing going on with a linear structure, in which every claim acts as a sub-argument for the ones that follow it. So here we have an argument with linear structure. Cats are mammals. Cats therefore have fur. It is possible for cats to shed. Cats might leave hair everywhere in your house. Now, if you notice here, we've taken away some of the indicator words, as it happens sometimes. But it still seems rather clear that each one of these is a conclusion, a sub-conclusion, that's supported by the claims above it. We start off with a basic idea. Cats are mammals. Because cats are mammals, cats therefore have fur. It's part of the definition of mammals that cats have fur. Now, we could add in more indicator words to make the structure of this even more clear. Therefore, because cats have fur, it is possible for cats to shed. If you have fur, the chance it can come off, and that you can shed. Therefore, cats might leave hair everywhere in your house. And as someone with 2 cats, I can heartily attest to this one. I can promise you, cats do in fact leave hair everywhere, including places you never dreamed they could leave hair. But, just like our diagram here, we have a premise that supports a sub-conclusion, which supports a sub-conclusion, which supports a sub-conclusion, and so on until we get to the main conclusion of whatever the argument is. And both of these can take place with any number of premises. There's no limit to how large or how small an argument can be. Now, in addition to argument and sub-argument structure, we can also talk about other sorts of patterns present in these arguments. With divergent structured arguments and linear structured arguments, we talk about the structure and the way that the premises and the conclusions are organized. Here we have a premise, conclusion, same premise, and a conclusion. And here we have premise, subconclusion, subconclusion, subconclusion. And these are just ways that we can label and describe what's going on here. But we can also talk about how the premises relate to each other as a matter of support, not just as attempted pieces of an argument, where I call this a subconclusion versus a main conclusion or whatever else. But we can also talk about how the different premises relate to one another. This has a significant amount of overlap, I will admit, with these sorts of ideas of structure. But when we talk about a couple of these different patterns of support, we are technically making small differences in how we're talking about these things. When we talk about support, we're talking about how a premise relates or counts in favor of other claims that are present in the argument. Whereas here, when we talk about structure, we're literally talking about whether a claim is performing the work, performing the function of supporting or being supported. So here, when we talk about the actual patterns of support, one of the main ones that we'll see are linked support arguments, or arguments with linked support. Now, arguments that have this sort of pattern to them have each premise supporting another premise. And in this sort of case, the argument only works if all of the premises are well supported. Much like a line of dominoes, where knocking over one will in turn knock over all the rest. I cannot talk today. Arguments that have a linked pattern of support make it to where every line in them supports another one. And the whole thing only works if every single member of that chain, every single link in that chain, fits together well. We can see this sort of thing with the linear structure argument again. Here we have cats are mammals, cats therefore have fur, it might be possible for cats to shed, and so on. But if premise one is false, if cats are not mammals, if it turns out they're a funky sort of chicken or something, then the rest of that argument no longer seems as rational or as well supported as it did in the first place. Lines 2, 3, and 4 all rely on the idea that cats are mammals. Because if it's false that cats are mammals, well, then we don't have nearly as much support for the idea that cats have fur. And it might not also be possible for cats to shed. If they're a kind of chicken and they have very small hair-like feathers, well, then it's not really true that they can shed or that they can leave hair everywhere. Every line in that argument starts falling apart because one of them was shown to be false. Now, convergent support patterns are a bit different. They're an entirely different way of organizing the dominoes so that they strike each other, or so that the different premises support the conclusions involved. Here, like I said, we have it to where each one connects in a straight line. If we want to borrow our diagram again, they flow in a straight line from one premise to another. Now, convergent support arguments have independent premises, totally separate reasons and bits of evidence coming together to support the conclusion. Here we might have something like, suppose we take the fact that cats are mammals, and suppose that I have the entirely separate fact that there is cat hair on my jacket this morning. Those two facts taken together can converge or come together to help support the conclusion that cats can shed. It's possible for cats to shed. It's less tightly fit together as the pattern of linked support, where one premise supports another one, which supports the next one, and so on, where if any one of the dominoes is removed or stopped, the whole thing stops. The convergent argument or convergent patterns of support instead have these separate pieces coming together to support and give reasons for believing the conclusion. Here we could disprove or show to be false one of the different claims, And while that might weaken the overall argument, again, stuff that we'll talk about later when we actually get to evaluating this stuff, while showing that one of those pieces is false might weaken the argument, it doesn't necessarily just automatically shut it down. And this is something that's worth knowing. These different patterns of support affect how we should judge an argument to be good or bad. If we look at an argument and say, oh, this has a pattern of linked support built into it, then we know that if any one of those premises gets shown to be false, we've got good reason for rejecting that conclusion. But if instead it has convergent support going on, or if it has a combination of linked support and convergent support, well, then that's an entirely different kind of structure to it. And yes, we can combine these. They're not mutually exclusive. But my point overall is, knowing the structure about these is going to make it easier for us to critically and deeply evaluate and compare arguments and see whether or not they're actually justified for us to believe. Now, to sort of round out our toolkit on looking at structure and laying out arguments in a particular standardized form, there are a couple of things that are worth mentioning. And again, your book has more examples and a few additional tips from these, but the ones that I wanted to stress in particular are reminding you guys again that conclusions can be found in multiple different places in the text of an argument. In standard form, conclusions come after the premises that support them. But in ordinary English, it definitely ain't necessarily so. We might say something like, the sky is blue. I saw the sky today and it looked blue to me, so therefore, I believe the sky is blue. In this sort of situation, we have the conclusion, the sky is blue, showing up in two different spots. It starts the argument and it ends it. And we have our indicator word strategies to help identify this, but being aware of the fact that it can be anywhere in the argument, start, finish, middle, whatever, is an important thing for us to remember. We have to go back and be mindful of the context in which a particular argument shows up. It's also worth noting that in standard format, we convert all of the different elements of an argument into individual statements. But out there in the wild, in the real world, statements can often be lurking in forms that don't make it obvious that they're statements. You might have a point that's hiding in the midst of a rhetorical question, which is simply a question that presumes or anticipates a particular kind of answer. Take something like, if you won't help him, who will? This kind of question is really meant to make a point. It's trying to perform some function of rhetoric, of convincing you of something. It's not a legitimate question of, oh, well, if you don't do it, then who will take your place? Will it be Joe? Will it be Sandy? Will it be Raj? That's not what's going on when we ask that kind of question. And rhetorical questions are really statements that are hidden in the form of a question. So if we take the example of, if you won't help, then who will, as an example rhetorical question, looking at that, we can pull out the just straightforward claim that if you don't help, no one will. Because that's really the kind of point that the question's making. And we can sort of translate that question into a statement and then plug it into our standard form template. Similarly, we might run into imperative statements that are hiding more normal looking claims for us to work with. Like, say, take the idea that if you do your homework, you'll get better grades. So do your homework. That final point is not a claim about the world, at least in the normal way that it's written. It's written instead as what's called an imperative. It's an instruction for you to do. But imperatives really are hiding a certain kind of should statement. They're fundamentally normative. They establish what you should and shouldn't do by saying that you do this. It really implies You should do this. So oftentimes we can look at imperative statements and translate those into some form of a should statement, rather than taking the argument about doing your homework, say. If you've got a nice little rinky dink 2-line argument, if you do your homework, then you'll get better grades. So do your homework. You could translate that second point into the much more standard form friendly, you should do your homework, which now looks a whole lot more like the rest of our claims and the rest of our sentences and gets to be a whole lot easier for us to work with. But not all imperatives are created equal. Not all questions are rhetorical questions. So we do still have to be mindful of context. I know I've repeated that like 3 or 4 times now, but really it is the core of being able to identify and label these different structures of arguments and concepts out in the real world. Now, a couple of other things that we can use to analyze all of this. Another tool we can use is something called scope. Or rather, this is another aspect of an argument or of a claim that we can identify, label, and use to help evaluate and talk about these things. Now, the scope of a claim is literally how big that claim is, not in the size sense of how big is it written or how loudly was it said, but rather how many things or people does that claim cover and talk about. And here we can have different scopes ranging from the universal, saying that all of X, Y, or Z is a certain way, all the way down to the individual. You and only you are XYZ. The scope of a claim, we don't talk about the scope of an argument, but the scope of a claim is literally just how many of that thing does it affect? How big of a claim is it making about the world? We might also label and be able to identify the commitment present in a given statement or argument. Now, commitment, when we're talking about arguments, has to do with how qualified or tentative that a claim is, not necessarily. It's a little bit of how committed the speaker was to it, but in theory, it is possible for a speaker to be uncommitted entirely to the things that they say. Now, here when we talk about things being qualified or tentative, we're talking about words and concepts like probably or only or as far as I know. That sort of clue and sign that we're not quite certain of the kinds of things that we're arguing for. So with scope and commitment, we really have 2 different things that we can measure and identify when we look at the different parts of an argument. Scope tells us how big a particular claim is, how many things it affects or talks about, and the commitment tells us how certain or how qualified, in the sense of like adding qualifiers to a word or to a claim that the speaker has for us. And both of these matter because they show us how easy it is to support or reject a claim. Universal claims like all Americans like cheeseburgers, or all ravens are black, if we want to look at the example right here on the side. These types of claims are very difficult to support and prove to be true, and they're actually very easy to disprove. Universal claims only need a single counterexample to show that they're false. Like, take this example over here on the right. All ravens are black, therefore being black is an essential quality of being a raven. This is something that is very, very easy in a philosophical sense to disprove. All you have to do is find a single non-black raven and the whole argument falls apart, because the first claim is universal in scope. It talks about all ravens everywhere. And the second claim involved in it, the conclusion, relies very strongly on that first claim. We obviously have some linking support going on here. Similarly, the commitment involved with the given claim will show how easy or difficult it is to prove or disprove. Compare these two different statements. The sun will rise tomorrow versus the sun will probably rise tomorrow. Now, both of those may be very well supported by the facts that are listed with them. They may be well supported by their premises. But the level of commitment involved changes how much is necessary to prove this sort of thing. It changes what standards of evidence and what standards of support should we be looking for. When we say that the sun will rise tomorrow, we're talking in a definite way. We're talking in the language of certainties, of totally unqualified, untentative claims about the way the world is. Whereas if we say the sun will probably rise tomorrow, all of a sudden we've given ourselves a way out. We've started describing a world in which other things can happen. If we say the sun will probably rise tomorrow, that's a whole lot easier to prove than the idea that the sun will rise tomorrow. Because the idea that the sun will probably rise is something that we can back up with our individual experience. We can say something like, well, the sun's always risen before, and so probably it'll rise tomorrow. Whereas in the first case, saying the sun will rise tomorrow, in order to actually prove that true, we're going to have to show something like, well, there's nothing that's going to stop the sun from rising. There's nothing that's going to blow up the sun. Or maybe the earth will survive until then, or whatever else. So the commitment and the scope of a claim changes how easy it is to prove or disprove quite drastically, actually. So these are things that are very much should be on your radar as potential grad students and just people in general. Now, a final tool that we can use when we're talking about and understanding arguments and how they fit together kind of comes as a twofer. 2-for-1 for those non-English native speakers. This sort of two-pack is two entirely separate tools that can be used in isolation but fit together very, very well. And these are the principle of charity and the idea of unstated or hidden premises or conclusions. Now, the principle of charity is a guideline for interpreting arguments. It doesn't tell us necessarily about the parts of an argument. It's going back to when we first talked about there are 3 different elements of critical thinking. There's the actual skill in applying the tools of logic. There's the knowledge of tools of logic. And then there's the attitude with which we approach problems and subjects. The principle of charity is one of the things that we ought to keep in mind that has to do with that kind of attitude that we take towards various claims. The principle of charity effectively says that you shouldn't read arguments in the worst possible way. You shouldn't read an argument as if the arguer is sloppy or illogical or dumb or badly informed or whatever else. Now, instead, you should try and be somewhat charitable. You should be somewhat nice and try and give them a little bit more credit than you might have thought at first. And this is a general guideline rather than an absolute rule for evaluating arguments. Our textbook has a couple of paragraphs discussing why you should have a moderate principle of charity, or whether you should be moderately charitable rather than taking an extreme form of this kind of idea. An extreme version of the principle of charity would say something like, well, you should always read arguments in the best possible way. And there are some instances where that's just simply a mistake. There are plenty of arguments that do actually have flaws. And the best possible way might be pretending that those flaws don't exist. Whereas a more moderate version of the principle of charity, being moderately charitable, might do something where, or might encourage us to look at some problem or situation that has gaps in it and say, well, the author is probably intelligent and well-meaning. They probably didn't mean to leave the gaps here. They probably had something in mind that should fill this rather well. And so that principle of charity is effectively asking us to putting is encouraging us to put on our believing hats for just a few minutes and see, well, does this work? Is there any way that it actually works? Um, and in practice, this will end up looking something like the guideline that so long as you don't have reason to do so, you shouldn't automatically assume that an argument that looks illogical or has some gaps in its reasoning, you shouldn't automatically assume that it actually does have gaps in its reasoning. Instead, you should approach it as if the author was well meaning and intelligent and say, well, maybe there's something that's left out. Maybe they're assuming something that's perfectly fine to assume. So let me test this and look at it. And this is where we get our final tool to use, the one that goes along with the principle of charity. And that's the idea of a hidden premise or a hidden conclusion. Now, we hinted at this just a little bit previously, when I think at the end of the last lecture, I did actually make a comment about one or two of our example arguments relying on an unspoken premise, a premise that was not part of the actual written argument. And sometimes this is very much the case. There are simply some arguments that don't list all of their premises right there in the open for you to see. Consider this example. Picard is more educated than Kirk, therefore Picard is the better leader. Now, this is an argument that is 100% irrefutably true. And for you non-Star Wars fans, that was me geeking out a little bit. Not Star Wars, Star Trek. My, it's getting late. But this argument right here could be a good argument. But if we simply look at it at face value, it seems as though there is a bit missing. It seems like it's quite a bit of a jump to go from more educated to better leader. So, if we take that principle of charity and we try and be at least moderately charitable, if we assume that whoever wrote this argument had good intentions in it, or that they're overall thoughtful and had a good idea when they were writing this sort of thing, we can test and see, okay, is there something I can add that I can put in here that fills the gap between premise and conclusion? And in this case, there is. This argument with Picard and Kirk relies on the unspoken claim that being educated makes you a better leader. If we assume that that was what the author meant, then we can easily fill in the gap between premise and conclusion, and now it makes a whole lot more sense. Picard is more educated than Kirk. Having more education means that one is a better leader. Therefore, Picard is the better leader. Now, this may still end up being a bad argument. Our substitute for the unspoken or hidden claim isn't necessarily a solution in all situations. And it's worth noting that if we add too much to an argument, we'll actually lose sight of what the original thing looked like. If you see an argument that has lots of gaps and holes to it, and we fill in too many of them, well, then now we're no longer dealing with that argument. We're dealing with our polished up Hollywood version of it, in which we've created this sort of illusion of what we wanted to see. Similarly, if we can take this the other way, and if we're not careful with how we approach problems and topics, we might instead accidentally create what's called a straw man and commit the straw man fallacy. And we'll talk about this in detail when we get to fallacies towards the end of the semester. But a straw man fallacy, or building a straw man, is a mistaken reasoning that people make. It's where you intentionally set up a weak argument, a bad argument, just so that you can criticize a view that you don't agree with. Like, say, if there are two different political parties. Let's assume for a minute that you're a Republican. And you start misrepresenting what Democrats actually believe, and then criticizing this imaginary version of a Democrat. That's not really proving that your point's true. It's only showing that this imaginary opponent doesn't really have good ideas. And since you made the opponent, you got to choose how strong or weak or how good or bad their ideas were. So even though when we look for hidden claims, it's perfectly fine to add what's missing, to try it out, and to continue evaluating the argument, it is worth being careful of doing so more than just a couple of times in an individual argument. Because the more of those that we fill in, the more risk we have of either making straw men or misrepresenting someone else's views. Now, I know we've moved rather quickly through all of this. Your book, for one, has many more diagrams and examples of all of these concepts. And homework one for this unit has you practice most of these sorts of concepts. So, if you haven't already, make sure to take a little bit of time to take a look at the homework and the first journal, as well as maybe start considering that quiz that you need to do by the end of the unit. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. In the meantime, though, make sure to let me know if you have any questions. Take a look at your book and the materials that we've gone over, and happy thinking. I'll